Welcome, everyone. My name is Aldous Krachunas. I'm the Assistant Director at Michigan State University's Executive Development Programs, and I'm pleased to invite you to our webinar today, Do You Have the Right Processes, led by my friend and colleague, Ralph Smith from Orion Development Group.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to second all this and welcoming everybody. We've got about an hour here, and the subject is, do you have the right processes? And the main focus of this will be on success in the future with staffing and making sure that you can satisfy your customer base and be ready for the workplace of tomorrow. So, with that as a general overview, Aldous is going to cover a couple things here with you.
So we started these lifelong learning webinars a few months back because learning should be not just in the classroom, but in all different places. And we chose this topic because where people should be working, certainly in the past 5 years, has been a critical topic. You know, in any event that I'm at, one of the first questions is, how many days a week do you work from home? And what we're seeing in discussing this topic is that the processes supporting work from home, work from office, or work from anywhere aren't always matched. And we see that not just for that question, but here's some examples that we're all familiar with. 5 years ago, when we started, many people working from home, the processes were not in place. I've talked with people that work in sales where they have a bonus program. Unfortunately, the processes for inventory are not matching the bonus program. Or frequently, we're asked to learn new IT systems, and all too often, it's more of a figure it out on your own rather than intentionality in terms of what's being done. So that's why we chose this topic on processes, because if they're done right, and Ralph is the expert, but if they're done right, they can support what is the appropriate policy. So our goal today isn't to discuss the policy in and of itself, but making sure that there's coherence between the policy and the processes supporting them. I invite you to ask questions during today's webinar. There's both the chat feature and there's a Q&A feature within Zoom. And myself and my colleague Keith Garoya, who's on the call as well, will be monitoring that and be asking Ralph the questions as they come in. So truly, this webinar is for you. I highly encourage you to take advantage of it. And I look forward to your engaging questions as we go through today's webinar. So back to you, Ralph.
Yeah, I would definitely second that in terms of asking questions. You know, a lot of times I'll do seminars that are 3, 4 days long. And when you have that, you can kind of touch base at the end of each day and see how we're doing and adjust accordingly. But with a, maximum of a 1 hour shot here, there's not a lot of time to catch up. So make sure you feel free to speak up, ask the questions that are on your mind. Our agenda, okay, we've got 4 things here. First of all, discuss the changes in the world that I say once again have put a premium on business process performance. I've been working process improvement for a lot of years, and it seems like the more things change, the more pressure is put on processes. And I think the different staffing models is just another really good example of why you have to have really good processes in place. And companies deploy those in a number of different ways, as I'm sure you know. So we'll look at the pluses and minuses of return to office, work from home, work from anywhere. One of the poll questions we'll ask is, which one of those do you feel does fit or will fit best for your organization? So interested in your thoughts on that as we go through this. Discussing the process for ushering your processes into the next era. Now, ERA is an acronym there. What it stands for is eliminate, redesign, and automate. We have a process we go through in our organization for kind of getting your processes ready for the future. So that really applies to staffing. So you have to kind of decide what the finish line is and then decide what processes will fit those. I'm going to show you a tool. We always hate to do webinars without having some kind of takeaway. We're going to talk about a tool known as a staircase diagram. The purpose of that is to help you think through your current processes and then look into the future and think about what is going to be needed for you and your employees to be successful based on the model that you chose. Okay. So, with that, process issue related issues of the day. There's a lot of things that are changing in the business world that, in my opinion, put pressure on processes. One of them is technology can be a great enabler when it's adopted properly. Okay. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's almost like we've got a strategic plan for technology and a strategic plan for everything else, and the two really don't fit together. Okay. But it's an important puzzle piece if you really want to be successful in the future, especially if you're going to this staffing models that have the workforce more distributed. Second thing, issue of the day, competition is more global versus local. You know, if we were doing this seminar sometime in the distant past, if you were in Lansing and somebody asked who your competitors were, they'd be other companies in Lansing or other companies in Michigan. Okay. But today, with the nature of processes and how they've evolved, sometimes it's not enough to be the best in a local market. You've got to be the best anywhere, okay, if you're really going to compete. So that puts pressure on processes. Rising customer expectations. That's a trend that's been going on for many years. You know, I still remember when I was a little kid, my dad took me out when he was buying a car. And the last thing the salesman said to him before we left the lot was make a list of all the things that's wrong with it over the next couple months and then bring it in and we'll fix them all. And you think about how far we've come from those days. So customer expectations constantly rising, again, puts pressure on processes. Migration to self-service. Okay, whether we're shopping on Amazon or whether we're checking when our FedEx delivery is going to happen ourselves or whether we're doing online banking, a lot of migration to self-service. Now, that can be a win-win because as consumers, we don't have to wait. And as companies, we don't have to invest as much in staffing. Okay, but it does put pressure on processes as you're making that transition. And as a result of all of those, sometimes internal processes don't evolve fast enough, which put pressure on processes as well. Now, I could have given you this same list 7 years ago, and the particulars of each one might have been a little bit different, but the issues and dealing with them, okay, they've been around for a while. But then the pandemic really changed the game. Okay, because it forced us to think about how to do business different ways. So kind of the evolution to revolution type of thing. There were two quotes that stood out to me back in the day. In 2020, right at the heart of the pandemic, I just got a pop-up on my screen that Mark Cuban was about to do a podcast on LinkedIn. And so, all right, you know, I didn't have a lot to do that day. I tuned in. And he was basically taking questions from the crowd. It wasn't a predetermined speech or anything. But one of the things that really stuck to me, he had a two-pronged approach. First of all, you got to do what you can to survive. Okay, I mean, you got to get through this rough spot. That's the short-term thing. But what I've got here was the second point of his presentation that day. He said some of the greatest companies of the future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, will be born out of the ideas that were generated during the pandemic of 2020. I think we're on the way to seeing that become a reality. Okay. The other thing is, I don't know if I'm a big fan of the Joker. If you've never seen the Dark Knight, the Joker wasn't the Joker because he was funny. He was the Joker because he was an anarchist. No rules, no, whatever. And one of the things he said in the movie that really stuck with me when he was talking to Batman, he says that, the mob wants you gone because then they can go back to the way things were, right? But he said, I know the truth. There's no going back. You've changed things forever. And the pandemic has really done the same thing. And if you want any evidence of that, look at what we're doing right now. Okay, pre-pandemic, there were no, Zoom and all this kind of stuff, so we could interact this way. As a consultant, I had about 3.7 million miles on Delta when the pandemic hit. And I think today I've got probably 3.74 5 years later, because it completely different, deconstructed and then reconstructed the way we do our business. It's very rare that I'll actually go get on an airplane anymore. Just one small example, but the processes are all different than they used to be. Okay. So, the different ways companies have chosen or are choosing to adjust to the new realities. So I've got return to work, return to office, work from home, work from anywhere. So return to office, that's definitely the most traditional one. So when we talk about that, there's pluses and minuses to each, by the way, in my opinion, but it's preferred by employees that value engagement. Now, the research has showed that there are two groups that fit into that category. One are the 20 somethings that are relatively new to the workforce, okay, and they're getting acclimated and so forth. And the other are the 50 somethings who value the engagement as well. Okay. So that is preferred by those groups. Okay. Another plus, it increases the probability that the new staff is getting the support they need. There is ease in being able to reach out and touch someone and say, hey, what's up? Or how do I do this? Now, jumping down here to the bottom, it does afford the least amount of flexibility for employees. I mean, obviously, when you've got to be in by this time and here at least this much time, and here's how much you go to lunch and so forth. So, everybody's familiar with that. Interesting to me, it's being mandated more and more by big companies. And the four that you've got down there are on the list of companies that are mandating that. And it is for a variety of reasons. One that I thought was, too big to overlook was that it's kind of shifted from an employee-focused job market to an employer-focused job market. So employers have an illusion, or not, I won't say it's an illusion, a feeling of more control when they have all the employees with them. Okay. So that is kind of a pushback, pendulum swinging back type of trend. Now, when you're talking about work from home, it enables hybrid models that can be popular with employees and can be phased in when they're new and in need of development. My daughter works for a company called Locum Tenens, who does medical credentialing. And when she first started, she had to be at the office every day. But once you get to a certain proficiency level, then you can go to 3 days a week. And once you get to another proficiency level, you can get to a couple days a month. She still has to go in from time to time, okay? But for the most part, she works from home. Now, one of the drawbacks there-ish is that it can restrict access to the labor to the same geographic area of the company. Because if you do have to go in from time to time, then you've got to be somewhere close, okay? And when I say sometimes isn't practical, I work, one of my biggest client for the last 14 years is Children's Medical Center in Dallas, okay? Now, they don't do surgery from home, okay? But a lot of the office employees who don't need regular interaction that I interact with, they have a couple days in the office and a couple days at home each week, and they coordinate it so they're all in at the same times. But if you're in a business that is obviously heavily predicated on face-to-face interaction, that's not going to work, okay? Now, work from anywhere is probably, it's an extension of working from home. It does enable access to a bigger labor market. And when I say there, it can be advantageous to companies in remote locations. I worked with Alcoa Packaging, whose headquarters is in Randolph, New York. And whenever I'm doing a session like this face to face, I'll ask how many people have been to Randolph, New York, and I've never had anyone raise their hand. It got 896 people last time they did a population count. But they had a very difficult time retaining engineers, tech talent, and so forth because it's a remote location. Okay. But work from anywhere wipes that barrier away. Okay. I mean, if you can access the employees or the knowledge wherever they reside, that gives maximum flexibility to employees, and it's a win-win for the company as well. Now, sometimes it's not practical for the same reasons as work from home. If you're in an organization where you have to have face to face interaction, that's, it's not going to work. Now, having said that, my company right now for the last several years is Orion Development. That's my consulting company. We work from anywhere before work from anywhere was a thing. Okay. But this thing about sometimes isn't practical. If you had asked us before the pandemic if it would work that we do all of our stuff remotely, we would have laughed in your face. We'd say, no way, until we were forced to really think through how to do it. And once we were forced to think through how to do it, this is way more efficient for us than the old way of doing things. Okay. So when you talk about sometimes isn't practical, perhaps sometimes organizations overreach with that and think it isn't practical without even really thinking about whether it could be. So that's a questionable minus. One thing that is true, though, carries the highest risk of employee isolation and lack of knowledge sharing. You've got to have crackerjack processes backing you up if you're talking about work from anywhere. My first job ever was at United Airlines, and the guy who had been in, if you've ever gone online and saw that the city you wanted to, the city pair you wanted to leave for, travel to, you could leave at 8:38 in the morning and get in at 11:16, and the first thing you thought was, what kind of an idiot came up with that? Well, that was my job. Okay. I was the only one in the airline that did that. Okay. The guy that had the job before me did it for 36 years, and they brought me in 6 months before he retired, and he showed me the ropes, and the plan was for me to do it for the next 36 years. But the thing was, I left after 6 months with 2 weeks notice and carried all the knowledge on how to do that right out the door with me. So if you're going to have work from anywhere, you got to really safeguard against that. You've got to be able to have processes stay behind when the talent moves along. Okay. And the employee isolation, not for nothing, I could make the argument that, the hospitals in Dallas that I work with now, and I'm in Atlanta, and if people don't email me for a couple of days, I start wondering what's wrong. So a lot of times with work from anywhere, the companies organize bi-monthly or quarterly get-togethers so people can stay in touch and feel like a team, because that really is part of it. Okay. So there's a lot of different, again, pluses and minuses, different ways to look at staffing model deployment. So,
question, Ralph, if I may.
sure.
So from what I'm hearing going through this slide, it seems that some of the challenges from work from home or work from anywhere is because the underlying processes are still based on a return to office. Would that be a fair statement?
It's a fair statement. Our business exploded with opportunities at the start of the pandemic for two reasons. One was because processes that were cracked but serviceable when you were working together, okay, working in the office, broke completely. Okay, when they tried to move to more remote execution. All right. And the other thing was new processes were needed because the old ones didn't work. It just didn't apply to the new situation. So no, that's a very relevant comment. So now, what do they all have in common? Well, they need the right processes to make them work with maximum efficiency. Just as a quick poll question, I'm going to turn it over to Keith here, but you have a poll popping up here about which model sounds best for your organization. And I'll, as you think forward, if you ran the zoo, which one of these would you say is the best for you?
Hey, Ralph and everyone. Poll should be launched.
Yeah.
You might see
And
two
we're just
questions.
answering question one for now.
Thank you, Ralph.
Yeah.
And Ralph, just in the interest, it looks like we have everybody responded. 17% return to office, 0% work from home, 17% work from anywhere, and then the majority of the group, 2/3, hybrid in office, 3 days a week, and then 0% not sure.
Okay, so hybrid drove the day. Um, I can see that. I think that's a good balance if the companies, it depends on the nature of the business. And again, if we were face to face, it would be great to hear, what organizations you're all with and that kind of thing. But I've seen my daughters are in their 20s and early 30s, and their generation, hybrid works for them. Going in 5 days a week is kind of anathema. That's like, don't want to do it if there's any way to avoid it. So interesting. Okay. Now, no matter which model sounds best for your organization. Moving on to our next objective of the presentation, thinking about getting your processes ready. Now, we recommend a 3-step approach, and the approach starts with eliminate. Okay. So, in other words, as you look at your processes, how many of them have outlived their usefulness? Now, I mean that in general, because they were created for a reason many years ago that just doesn't apply to the business anymore, or specific to your staffing model. If you're going to move from return to work to, in office to remote, this process isn't going to, it's not going to apply. It's not going to fly. So we look to eliminate first, because you'll see this on the next slide. But one of the things I hope everybody takes out of this is, before you try to improve a process, you really need to ask the question, should we be doing this at all? Okay? Because a lot of times processes do outlive their usefulness. So typically when we talk about how to set up an organization to support the workforce of tomorrow, we look at the processes that just don't fit anymore. Now, the ones that do fit but are inefficient, subject to redesign. Okay? So what can we do? How can we change these to make them more efficient? And once the processes have been redesigned, the automation comes in. Now, I say that automation is the 3rd step there, not because I think it is the least important of the 3. It's because my experience has been a lot of times people jump to that too quickly. Okay. You don't want to automate processes that you shouldn't be doing at all. Okay. You don't want to automate inefficient processes, because that magnifies the inefficiency. I've got a quote from Bill Gates coming up here at the end that's where I picked that up. Okay. So, but making sure that you've got the right processes and are designed properly, that's where automation can be a big leap forward for you. Okay. Now we're going to focus on the elimination, because that's the first step first. Okay. So,
Ralph, quick question on the previous slide. So when you're redesigning the process, might there be cases where you're already looking ahead to whether or not you might be automating it after the redesign, because that might influence the redesign approach, or not necessarily?
sure. Yeah. I mean, always looking ahead, even when you start with the eliminate, looking ahead to what the finish line is important. I mean, that's a great lead in here. Okay. As you think about what work model works best for you, that's what I meant by the flags here. Think about the finish line. Where do we need to end up with all of this? Okay. Now, no matter which model you picked, I do recommend generating a process inventory. Now, when I'm face to face with people, I ask, how many processes do you have? And they'll say thousands, tens of thousands, an unlimited number. Absolutely true, and I agree with that. I wouldn't recommend you try to generate a process inventory, meaning create, every little micro process that could ever possibly happen. That'll be a career-long event for you, trying to make a list of those. But if you think about your big processes, the ones that come to mind first, the ones that may be cross-functional, have a lot of people involved, or are executed a lot of times. I'm going to give you an example here in a little. We started this with a client company. We came up with about 110 what they considered their key processes. I mean, these are the things we do. All right. Now, after you generate the inventory, you conduct what's called a staircase diagram. And the purpose of the staircase diagram is to think through each one of those 110 or whatever it is processes and say, why do we do this? Okay. And if it is something we need to keep doing, what do we need to do to maximize the efficiency? And again, it starts with eliminate because you're asking whether you can do it at all, should do it at all before you ask whether you should do it better. Now I have an example for you that will walk through the staircase diagram. So targeting the appropriate processes for termination and determining the proper actions needed to terminate. That's what this is for. I've got my little Terminator notes here. So, okay, so 3 examples of processes that could potentially be targeted for termination. The example I've chosen today is a pension system. This is a real world example. All of these were real processes. All right. One of the key processes at the pension system was contribution review. Now, what that meant was their biggest customer was their state university. And the state university had a glitch in their system. Every one of the employees made contributions to their pension account every paycheck. But because of the glitch in the system, 100% of the contributions were inaccurate. Now, they weren't way off. They were just a few pennies up or a few pennies down, but they still had to be fixed. So in the name of customer focus, the pension system assigned one of their senior analysts, one of their stars, because this was their biggest customer, to review all the contributions each pay period and adjust them up or adjust them down. Okay. Now, those of you that are process improvement folks might say, well, that's not right. You're treating the symptom as opposed to the cause. And so you're not, getting to the root of the problem. That's absolutely true. But they're trying to be customer focused. So that's what they did. Now, over the course of time, the state university fixed the glitch in the system. So now all of a sudden, all the contributions were coming out accurately. So the senior analyst was going through all of these every pay period and not finding anything. Now, little side note, okay? What would happen in your organization if one of your people found that there was a process that didn't need to be executed anymore because the reason it was created wasn't applicable? Now, in the pension system, that senior analyst went right on inspecting all of the contributions every pay period for months/years, okay? And when I'm face to face with people, I'll ask them, why do you think she did that? And somebody say, well, job security. Well, she was one of their stars. She didn't have to worry about not having stuff to do. The reason why she kept inspecting all of this, even after there wasn't anything to find, was it never occurred to her that the organization might want to terminate a process, or that it was within her authority to suggest that they terminate a process. Okay. And a lot of organizations have stuff like that. We do this because we've always done it. Okay. So again, what would happen in your organization? Would that person raise their hand and say, listen, we got to get rid of this? Well, if not, the staircase diagram can be very useful because it'll point out things like that. Another example, remote counseling sessions. This is a tough one because this was customer focused. I'm sure you have some processes that are designed to make the customer experience more palatable, more enjoyable, or whatever. Well, in this particular case, about 6 months before retirement, each of their members was supposed to meet with one of their counselors. All right. And all the counseling sessions were done at the state capitol. Now, this was a pretty big state. Okay. So somebody came up with the idea that let's be customer focused, member focused. Let's go out to the bigger cities in our state. And, we'll go in the day before, we'll get a night in a hotel, and we'll set up in a conference room, and we'll see people closer to where they live to save them the trip to the state capitol. Okay. And that sounds like a great idea. All right. But what happened over time was, this was pre-pandemic, by the way, what happened over time was they started to see they were getting about a 40 to 50% no-show rate on these remote sessions. All right. Simultaneously, there was an 8 to 10 week wait at headquarters to see a counselor. All right. So they're spending all this extra money and resources to go out and see half the people they would have seen had they done it at home. All right. So here's where you have to ask the question, are we getting enough customer bang for the buck out of this to continue it? Now, pre-pandemic, that was a legit question. Now you might say, well, we'll just do it on Zoom. So I think this is a good example of both types of how it can outlive its usefulness, either because the reason it was created isn't worth the cost, or we can come up with a really better and easier way to do it now. Okay. And of course, if the customers are remote, the internal people can be remote as well. They don't have to go to the office to do a Zoom meeting. So that can change your staffing perspective as well. All right. The last thing I'd cover here, if you do a process inventory and start looking through it, one of the things you might find is a process that's been around forever. All right. In their particular case, if a member died, I'm not making this up. Evidently, way back in the 1970s, they had late night commercials for $2,500 worth of life insurance for retired people. And the purpose of the $2,500 was to pay for a funeral. Okay. And somebody at the time said, oh, well, geez, we need to do that for our members, $2,500 in life insurance to pay for the funeral. And they actually wrote it into law in that state. Okay. 50 years later, it's still $2,500. Okay. So number one, you can't even buy flowers for that anymore. So the original purpose, since if they're not going to increase the amount, the original purpose has been transformed. In addition to that, until every beneficiary was identified, they weren't allowed to pay anyone. Okay, so if you had a sibling that was in Borneo or something like that, they would literally hire a detective agency to find the people and bring them home. Okay, and they weren't able to tell the beneficiaries they could find how much the death benefit was until they found everybody. Now, if you can imagine this was anywhere from $500 to $2,500 based on years of service. So imagine being on the low end of that. Your parent passed away. You got 5 brothers and sisters. They spent 6 months trying to track everybody down. And when they did, everybody got a check for $82. Okay. I mean, it was not a customer focused process. Now, the question is, so in each one of these cases, have these outlived their usefulness? Should they be targeted for termination? Now, the staircase diagram would say that they should. Now, here's how you execute one if you want to give this a shot. First of all, hierarchy of questions, okay? And I do recommend, if you're going to give this a try, go in this order, all right? And as soon as you get a yes for each process, you're done. Okay, so if you start with 100 processes, 110 processes, whatever, and you go through this, you're just thinking through, why do we do these things? So the first level, do we execute this process because it is / will be, if we're looking to the future, core to running our business? Now, if you want a different way to define that, it's core if this is what you're in business to do. If you outsource that, it wouldn't be us. Okay. Delta's in business to fly people from place to place. If they outsource the air transportation, they're not an airline anymore. The pension system collects contributions and pays benefits. If they outsource that, they're not a pension system anymore. So is it core to running your organization? Because if it is, it's probably not going to be something you eliminate. Okay. But if it's not core to running your business, you move down to level 2. Do we execute this process because it is / will be required by law? All right. Now that death benefits thing I told you about is required by law. That's where we would get a yes, and that one would be categorized. Okay. But if it's not core and it's not required by law, do we execute this because we have or will have an internal reason or benefit for doing it? Pension system example. Surviving children got benefits until they turned 18, but if they were in college, they would get benefits until they were 22. Okay. But they had to verify that they were in college. So the pension system had a process where they would basically look for fraud. They would verify that the kids were still in college to continue giving the benefits for 4 more years. Okay. And the internal reason for that is obviously we don't want to fund fraud. Okay. So that was it. But if it's not core, if it's not required by law, and if there's no internal reason to do it, do we do this because the customers are going to benefit? And that would be the potential example for that remote counseling sessions example I told you about. Okay. Now, I've never seen a process fall all the way through that without getting a yes somewhere. If you have one, please send it to me because I'd like to know what the reason for it is if it's not one of those 4 things. But level 1 is just grouping them. Now, once the processes are categorized, put them under the magnifying glass, all right? And ask these questions. If it's required by law, is the law that determines that we do this worth challenging? That process in the pension system for survivor benefits was costing them about $7 million a year. Okay. Now, that's a significant chunk of change. But on the other hand, challenging the law is a long-term, low yield, low probability of success proposition. So that's not a slam dunk answer. You got to think through, is this worth challenging or not? Okay. If it's an internal benefit, does the internal benefit justify the cost? That checking for fraud, education fraud is a great example because they found very, very, very little fraud. If they were only making the decision based on whether this cost us financially, they would have said, no, we don't need to do this anymore. The problem was when one of those rare ones was caught, it was a public relations nightmare for them. Okay. So even though financially it probably would have made more sense not to check, they decided to keep that one in place. I understood the reasoning there. Now, does or will the customer benefit justify the cost? All right. Well, just like with the remote counseling sessions, right? In that particular case, it didn't before the pandemic because they were seeing half as many people. It really didn't afterwards because now we've got Zoom. We've got a different way to do it. Okay. But the problem is, or the point is, when you're thinking about ways to eliminate, okay, we've found this to be a really effective way to work through the logic and think about what could be targeted for termination. Any questions?
So one that's come up, people are often emotionally attached to processes because they did make sense at one point, and even if they don't, they feel like they've done something wrong. So there's that emotional aspect. Do you have any advice to attendees of how to deal with some of that emotional attachment or resistance that people may have, even if they go through this process and realize that process shouldn't be used anymore?
Data. If it's available, that's my number one advice. When we talked about those remote counseling sessions, there were people that loved that. They loved going out and meeting people and spending the night in the hotels and so forth. So you'll notice the way I brought that one up was we got an 8 to 10 week backlog at home base, weighed against the fact that we're going to spend all the money on the travel to see half as many people. Okay. So I wouldn't say, so deal with it. But, approaching it from the standpoint that I understand why you like to do this. I like to do this too. Okay. Just in the big picture, we can't afford it anymore, so there's the positioning. So, the ones that remain that are not eliminated, there's certain redesign. There's a process improvement toolkit. I'm sure y'all have seen, some of these things, but the whole point is, how do we get the processes ready for the future? Now, an example relevant to the staffing model in this particular organization, a quote unquote regular retirement followed the same 28 steps every time. A disability retirement followed about 25 of the steps in the middle, the same as the other one, but the input and the first step or two and then the last step were different. Okay. But these were being done by two separate departments as if they were completely different processes. And there were 3 or 4 other versions of that process done everywhere else as well. Okay. So combining those and making it a little more streamlined and make sure everybody understands that how many steps are the same and how easy it is to flow, that was a big step forward for them. And since we were looking at it on an organization wide level, it was a lot easier to find those things than if people were just in their little silos. Okay. Now, after you've done all that, sure, automation. Okay. I mean, AI is up there. Predictive analytics is a big thing. We're talking about telecommuting here. I mean, there's a lot of technology that can be extremely helpful. Now, is technology always the answer? I made a little thing here. IT depends. It depends. See what I did there. But the point is, I'm a big technology fan applied in the right spot. And when it marries up with processes as opposed to being independent to processes, I think that's the right spot. Okay. Got a poll question here, so I'll turn it back over to Keith. But which technique will be the most beneficial, do you think, for your organization? Elimination or redesign or automation?
Like Ralph, we've got a third voting eliminate, actually 25% eliminate, 60% redesign, and 20% automate.
Okay. What was the eliminate? 20%?
20%, correct.
20%. Okay. Don't want to make it sound like there's, am I still sharing? Yeah. Okay. I don't want to make it sound like you could eliminate 20% of your processes because 20% of the people voted for it. But any processes you can eliminate clears the way for that much more potential for redesign, in my opinion. So, but redesign is our business. We've been doing that for 30 years, so I totally get that. Now, has it worked? Well, I did want to leave you with some results here. When we first started at the pension system, we had 110 processes. That was their process inventory. We actually mapped them all. And for those of you that have mapped processes before, I'm sure the joy of mapping 110 of them is not lost on you. But as we did that, we discovered about 35 more, okay, that we really should have thought of on our original list. So if the process inventory isn't complete at first, you adjust. So we got up to 144. And then through discontinue, elimination, combining, as I talked about, and upgrading via technology, we were able to come out on the backside with 63 processes that were moving ahead into the workplace of tomorrow as we redesigned the organization. Now, that's a 56% reduction in process count. I'm not saying that we were 56% more efficient. I'm just saying that we were able to cut out a lot of stuff, okay? And we had better documentation and increased standardization of what was left. Now, now you might say, so what was their choice for staffing model? Well, this was pre-pandemic. Their objective was to redesign the whole organization around processes and be as efficient as possible. So it wasn't return to work, it was continue to go to work model would be effective. But we've kept in touch with them over the years. And because of the work they did at this phase of the game, as challenges came up, they have been able to move to the work for, I mentioned that the counseling sessions are a big deal. I told you they had a 10-week backlog. So they've got a lot of people working on those. And those have been able to migrate to work from home type of format. So they set themselves up for the staffing models of the future with the process work they did in the past. Okay. That kind of brings me towards the end of my piece here. Key takeaways, if you want to be successful in the future, your approach to deploying staff may need to change depending on what the nature of your business is. Make sure you have a clear and consistent view of which model works best for you. If somebody were to ask me what are one of the watch-outs, it's that everybody assuming that they're on an island and that they can do it their way and, have 6 different mechanisms for how we're staffing on an organization-wide level. So that's a potential danger. Assess the current processes and eliminate the ones that don't support the new business realities. And I'd say that from a staff attraction perspective and a customer satisfaction perspective. I don't think you can look at either one of those in complete isolation. Redesigning and modifying the remaining processes after you've eliminated is a big deal. And then stay current on the trends and technology and how it applies to you so you can maximize the process potential. And then just kind of bringing it home, make sure you can answer the question, what processes will the employee of tomorrow need to be successful as part of this organization? Okay, I mean, that's the final point. I threw a couple of questions in here, or a couple of parting thoughts in there. I'll always have liked the first one. I use that in a lot of seminars I do. Be an architect of the future, not a victim. Okay, so think this stuff through when you're thinking about through staff deployment issues. The Uber Elevate was something I'd never heard of when I put this in here. But the whole point of that quote was, your competitors of today might not be your competitors of tomorrow. So you've got to prepare thinking about the future. And then there's the Bill Gates quote to end with. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Aldous.
So if you can go back one slide there, Ralph, please. So talking about the redesign aspect, definitely that's a challenge. That's your core area. Would you recommend, besides collecting data, doing it as a pilot test if you're redesigning, or sort of go full in so that you're not running 2 parallel processes to see what works? Any insights on that?
My favorite consulting answer, but I really will say it this time.
It depends.
Okay. Sometimes, I mean, this is going to sound like a cop-out. Sometimes trial is great for minimizing risk. Okay. So if you have the opportunity to do that and you have the time to do it, then sure. If it's a complicated redesign opportunity that impacts multiple departments and you have to do something or you're in big trouble, okay, then I'm a big plan, do, check, act, obviously, standard process. But it's a matter of how comprehensive is the change you're going to make and how much time do you have. So I weaseled. It depends.
That's fine. I invite others to be asking questions. From your experience, the automation process, what do you see to be maybe the 1 or 2 biggest, I'll say, mistakes that companies make in automating processes?
I'll give you 2. One is, a lot of times automation is part of a strategic plan, and I think that's fine. Okay, I think it's great, actually. All right, but it can't be an independent part of the strategic plan from everything else. Okay, because you want your internal technology experts to understand the business so they know how to deploy the technology as a win for the company. Okay, so that would be number 1. The other thing I would say on automation is the Bill Gates quote here at the bottom. If you don't have your processes lined up first, you're going to give yourself the opportunity to magnify your inefficiency. So connecting the 2.
Okay, thank you. I heard a saying or quote recently, it was regarding AI, but the presenter said that AI is a tool, not a solution. And I think that also fits for automation. Automation for automation's sake doesn't make a lot of sense. And like that Bill Gates quote indicates, isn't going to give you what you want if the underlying process isn't working. So thank you for replying on those.
Sure.
I really like this webinar in particular because it fits with our previous one on managing generational differences. You mentioned generations along the way today, and certainly there's a combination to some extent on return to work, work from home, work from anywhere, along with some of these changes and approaches. Some generations may be more risk averse, more risk taking, I think is one thing that we're going to see. And also the comfort level that people have using data for decision making as well. So again, nice continuity in terms of the two topics. If today's topic and just the continuous learning resonates with you, I want to let people know we have a large variety of topics that we host here at Michigan State University within our executive development programs. My colleague Keith Groya runs our critical thinking for team leaders, and that will be taking place in a week, and we still are accepting registrations. AI strategy and governance, transforming your organization the right way. A lot of processes will be discussed there as well. And that's really not how to implement it, but how to set the framework that you need for that approach of what you're doing on AI. Finance for non-financial managers and finance for executives here on campus or a live online option. And then supply chain strategy and operation certificate program starting in February of next year. Michigan State University has been ranked top one, or top ranked, I should say, for pretty much the better part of the past decade in supply chain management. Great programs that we have in that area. February and March, we'll have our business process management, where either Ralph Smith or his colleagues will be teaching that. If you like today's approaches, ideas, we go even deeper, very interactive. Again, tools that you can be using to improve the processes that you have. So again, Ralph or his colleagues from Orion Group will be teaching those sessions. And then we also have our Railway Management Certificate program. Those are 4 sessions taking place in different parts of the country, but starting here at Michigan State University. And those will be in person starting in April. A lot more information on our website, but wanting you to be aware of what we're doing. We also do custom programs with companies across a range of different topics. It can be leadership, it can be financial acumen, strategy, or usually a combination of multiple topics. It's an iterative, collaborative process that we use to get to know your needs and how that program that you need and want can best fit the needs of your participants. With that, I'll add, we've been working over the past year or two in particular in having executive leaders from our partner companies also present to their participants, and having that synergistic approach is really having a tremendously positive impact. As a stakeholder of ours said, it truly brings the best of both worlds together and has a high impact on the participants within the program. So many ways to keep learning and keep advancing in what you're doing. So on the next slide, we have our contact information. So again, Keith Groya, he's been behind the scenes, but helping make everything go smoothly today. You can reach him directly through his email or phone number. And again, I'm Aldous Krachunas, also phone number 517-353-5664. I invite you to reach out. Again, no obligation, as they say. But what I tell any company, any person that we work with is, rather than assuming that the model of education is what you've experienced in the past, we take the approach that whatever the needs are of the company, we are able to meet those needs. We're nimble, we're creative, and we focus on you, the client, to make sure you're getting the best of what you need. So with that, I thank you for joining. Keep checking your emails. We have more webinars coming up towards the end of this year on supply chain and leading beyond the silo, and other topics certainly for 2026. So again, thank you for joining today, and I wish everyone a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ralph.